Let me know when we're ready to start.
Well, we are already live, so I think we should be starting.
Okay. Good evening. Buenos noches. Assalamu alaikum. Howdy. My name is Elise Bryant, and I have the honor of being the moderator for this evening's panel discussion, Labor and the Russian War in the Ukraine. Sisters, brothers, siblings, comrades, family. I bring you greetings from the Coalition of Labor Union Women and the Labor Heritage Foundation, who stand in support of this Labor and the Russian War Ukraine Forum. And I say to each and every one of you, welcome, union members. We are in your presence, hand in hand together. We make the union strong. Bienvenidos todos, los sindicalistas. Démonos la mano y fuerza es unión. I could go on in Spanish, but I won't because I really only know how to sing in Spanish and not really speak Spanish. But tonight's forum is sponsored by the founders and former leaders of U.S. Labor Against the War, USLAW, who recently reconvened in order to encourage labor support for a peaceful resolution of the conflict in the Ukraine. USLAW was organized in January 2003 to bring labor's voice to the peace movement and the peace movement's voice to labor in opposing the U.S. invasion of Iraq. In the process, we built strong ties to solidarity with the Iraqi labor movement. In the 15 years that have followed, USLAW had as many as 200 affiliated unions, central labor councils, and state federations, and successfully initiated the passage of an historic resolution by the AFL-CIO in 2005 that for the first time stated the AFL-CIO opposition to an ongoing U.S. war and called for the rapid withdrawal of all U.S. forces from Iraq. On March 29, 2022, the AFL-CIO issued the following statement. The AFL-CIO condemns the violent invasion of Ukraine by the Russian military. We stand in solidarity with the workers and their families who are impacted by the devastation and offer our condolences for lives that have been lost. Join me in welcoming our panel of lifelong activists for peace, justice, and the union way. Phyllis Bennis is the director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. In 2001, she helped found the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and now serves as the National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace. Bill Fletcher, trade unionist, writer, media commentator, and a past president of the TransAfrica Forum, who's also the author of a great book entitled They're Bankrupting Us, and 20 other myths about unions, where he busts 21 myths that have been going around for years by the right wing in order to talk badly about the trade movement, which we know is the backbone of democracy, right, Bill? Next, we'll have Sarah Nelson, International President of the Association of Flight Attendants, who on January 20th of 2019 called for a general strike to end the government shutdown. Y'all remember this? Which landed her on the cover of Fast Company magazine, and in Style magazine, she was listed as one of the badass women of the year. I don't know about that one, but that's what they said. Sarah has also brought a special guest to the panel, Captain Dennis Tager, who you will introduce and tell us a little bit more about him later, right? Okay, Sarah, thank you. And Carl Rosen, president of the United Electrical Radio and Machine Workers Union, which we commonly call UE. Brother Rosen was elected in 2019, and he told the convention delegates there, quote, "We are a union that practices rank and file democracy, unity against the boss, solidarity with our allies, internationalism, and aggressive struggle, which we know which side we're on." Oh, yes. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? And we know how this is going to go because we know which side you're on. That's why you're here tonight. So tonight, we've asked each of our panelists to give us a 3 to 5 minute overview of the Ukraine war from their perspective. After their opening statements, we will present questions we received in advance by registrants for discussion by our speakers. After that, we will open the floor to questions from you, which will be submitted through that Q&A Zoom feature, which has now been enabled, and you will be able to submit questions, and our facilitators will take them up and send them to me, and we'll get to them as time allows. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank all of you who turned out for tonight's discussion on the Russian war in the Ukraine. The response has been overwhelming, way more than we expected, so we thank you all for being here. Those of you who are in Zoom and those of you who are watching live stream. We all know the horror of war and how those with the least power, women, children, elderly, disabled, suffer disproportionate impacts from war. We also join with all good people of good conscience around the world in our collective condemnation of Putin's brutal, unprovoked invasion and repression of dissent and independent media in Russia. We believe it's absolutely essential that all working people be educated about the true causes of war, and that our voices need to be heard in the debates on foreign policy as much as domestic issues. We know these are difficult times to grapple with, and there is no unanimity in the thought of the labor movement on foreign policy in general or on this war in particular. All the more reason for forums like this to learn and to hear varying perspectives. I also need you to know that the Q&A feature is a one-way communication from each participant to the monitors, and there's no open chat function at this point, I think, for you to interact with each other. The chat will be used by Michael Essenscher to drop links for appropriate to the discussion at hand. So, hello, my panelist siblings. You know you have 5 minutes, and if you go over, I'll start singing, okay? So I'm going to start with Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis, and then we'll go to Bill Fletcher, followed by Sarah Nelson and Captain Tager, and then we'll close with Carl Rosen. He'll close us out. So, hi, Phyllis, you ready?
I'm ready, Elise. Thanks.
Thank
and
you.
Thanks to all of you for being here tonight. It's great seeing these amazing labor organizers and all of you taking on the work against war and militarism, which we know historically always hurts working people the most. So I'm supposed to do sort of an overview of the war in 5 minutes. That's not easy, but I'm going to do my best and try. And if I talk too fast, I'm sorry, but I spent 10 years in New York, so that's what happens. So we all know history is determined partly by when we start the clock, when we begin to look at what the situation is that we're trying to figure out. And right now, the clock needs to start with the urgency of right now, where we're needing desperately an immediate ceasefire and an end, a diplomatic end to this horrific war that is being waged in Ukraine. We can look at the past and the present and the future, and we need to look at all of them. But the focus needs to be on the urgency of now. So right now, what we're seeing is an enormous humanitarian toll being taken. This is, among other things, the biggest and fastest refugee flow in Europe since World War II. It is not the biggest and fastest in the world, but it is in Europe. And that's very important. It is presenting also something different. We know about the levels of hypocrisy and double standards and how other refugees have been treated, how other wars have been dealt with. But the reality is that that's only part of the problem that we face. It's a huge one, and it's only part. Another part of what makes this war distinct is that it represents a global threat, the actual threat of a potential nuclear exchange, and a threat most specifically to the global south, the most vulnerable countries in the world. We're looking at the possibility, the likelihood, because it's already underway, of greater militarization across Europe and beyond, and here in the United States, with billions and billions and billions more of our tax dollars being shunted directly to the military, using this war as the basis to justify it. It's going to create enormous challenges around the world as militarism spreads from Europe and the US to being used in much of the global south. Food shortages, we'll hear more about later. The shortfall in supporting other refugees, Afghan refugees, Syrian refugees, refugees from Cameroon, from Somalia, from Libya, so many places where there are desperate, desperate refugees who will not be able to get money because it's going only to these one this one set of very deserving refugees who also need support. So it's a very complicated issue. There are negotiations underway right now. They're just barely beginning. I think we have to be very careful to acknowledge and to accept the view that negotiations take a long time. Diplomacy is not easy, and the war will go on while talks are underway. It doesn't mean the talks are not important. The talks are still important. Some of the terms, we know what is likely to emerge at the end. There will be a ceasefire. There will be a withdrawal of Russian forces. Those are the first things that have to happen. Ukraine will have to decide that it's going to be neutral in the future, give up its claim to wanting to join NATO. The US troops and others will be moved away from the border. There will have to be longstanding negotiations over the status of Crimea, the status of autonomy or not in the eastern regions of the Donbass region of Ukraine. They're talking now in those talks about maybe 15 years. It could be a very long time. But what we need now is an immediate ceasefire and an end to the fighting and a withdrawal of Russian troops and Russian bombing. We do have to look at the past. Yes, there have been provocations by NATO and the US over the years. You could start with the creation of NATO in 1949 as an anti-Soviet weapon. And when the Soviet Union collapsed and NATO should have disappeared, it didn't. Instead, it was expanded, it was strengthened, and moved out of the defense of Europe to take on wars in places as far afield as Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere. It's unclear, it's been unclear whether Ukraine would join NATO. In 2008, NATO said, we welcome them to join. Other times they've said no. It's clear now Ukraine is not going to join NATO. These are longstanding challenges. None of them, they are provocations, and none of them legitimize the Russian invasion. This is on the Russian government. This is on Putin. Our focus, I think, needs to be on how do we help to end it? How do we create diplomacy and not war that's grounded in real information? So we start the clock now, starting with the humanitarian crisis, the environmental crisis that this war is creating, the threat of nuclear war. There are 5 countries in Europe where there are US nuclear weapons, not under those countries' control, under US control. Russia is threatening to use nuclear weapons. The modernization of so-called tactical nukes makes the threat of nuclear weapons ever greater. And that means it's something that is a global challenge that has to be taken up with enormous importance. We have to recognize that massive US military spending did not prevent this war, did not manage to prevent Russia from this kind of aggression. Spending more money on the military isn't going to do it either. So that's a huge challenge that we have to look at. We have to look at now, what are we hearing about? What is the reality when we talk about an immediate demand for a ceasefire and a Russian withdrawal? What is that going to look like? There is going to be diplomacy. We need information on what kind of dangers are inherent there. How do we protect from those dangers? The danger of escalation to a potential nuclear war. Not likely, not because either side probably wants to do it, but because when you have a direct exchange, like a no-fly zone, which we'll hear more about later, but that starts with an act of war, in this case by the United States against Russian anti-aircraft batteries, that's a direct US-Russian confrontation that could all too easily escalate, even to the horror of a nuclear exchange. The environmental destruction of every war that destroys land, destroys cities in this case, by the Russian bombs. It's leading to the creation of more oil, all of that. Militarism rising, the possible escalation, the desperate need for negotiations needs to be top of our agenda. And finally, the question of the future. What do we do? What's our obligation as labor people, as activists, as the peace movement? Yes, we have to challenge the hypocrisy and double standards of how these refugees are being treated, how the war is being focused on. And we do that by holding this up as a model. Every war, whether it's being waged in Myanmar or Sudan or Syria or Yemen or Somalia or Afghanistan or Iraq or Palestine, every one of those wars should be on the front pages of our papers, humanizing the victims of the wars, just like the victims of the war in Ukraine. Other occupations, whether Western Sahara or Palestine or Kashmir or anywhere else, every occupation should be opposed the same way. This is our opportunity to show how refugees should be treated, The clock has to start with the people who are being most affected. The clock starts and stops with human beings. Our job is to support the diplomacy, how to bring this war to an end using diplomatic means. We have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Phyllis. Bill Fletcher, you're up next. My brother
Thank you,
was called
Elise.
the W.B. Du Bois of our generation.
And I'm always flattered every time you say that. Thank you.
It's true.
So I'm going to be in agreement with much of what Phyllis said, but I'm going to start in a somewhat different place. I think that many progressives and leftists got this entire situation wrong early on. Many of us thought there would be no invasion, that it was all about a bluff. Many of us thought that the main issue here was NATO expansion. It turns out it's more complicated than that. In fact, on the night of the invasion by the Russians, when Putin announced and explained the rationale for the invasion, rather than focusing entirely on NATO, which one would have thought that he would do, he instead attacked the legitimacy of Ukraine, calling it national fiction. In 2021, he wrote an extensive paper explaining why, in effect, Ukraine has no right to exist, that Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus really are all the same people. We've heard that line of argument before by other countries under other circumstances. So the immediate situation is one of Russian aggression. It's an invasion. And there are those that wish to believe that the invasion is a denazification process, as Putin has argued. And that's sort of pretty close to absurd. Among other things, because if it's going to be about denazification, denazification really needs to begin at home, like in the Kremlin. When you look at the political character of the Putin regime, this is not a friendly movement or regime in support of the people's struggles around the world. This has been one of the headquarters of right-wing populist and neo-fascist forces globally, actively supporting various forces around the world, including in the United States. Now, what's interesting about the current situation is that the right wing globally has split, and that there are far right forces that, for their own reasons, have decided to side with Ukraine against Russia, and then there are those that are siding with Russia. But we should never misunderstand the political character of the Putin regime. It's really important now for us in the labor movement to rethink, what do we mean by internationalism? You know, many of us have been so used to opposing US imperialism and wars of aggression that we've become blinded to other possibilities. That yes, in fact, there are other demons out there, and those demons need to be opposed. The question is how? How do we exert solidarity? Telling the people of the Ukraine that they should stop fighting when they're being invaded doesn't work. But what does international solidarity look like? And what does it mean? How do we support the forces in Russia who are in active opposition to this war of aggression? What do we do about that? How do we try to narrow the expansion of fascist forces within the Ukraine military, while the Ukrainian people have every right to resist the Russian aggression? These are the sorts of questions that hopefully we will be discussing this evening. My final point, the critical question of national self-determination. That's what we're looking at here. The issue of sovereignty, the issue of the right of peoples to exist as independent nation states. And one of the things that's been very disturbing is that in all of the discussions about how Russia needs security, and there need to be promises of security, I've rarely heard people say, what kind of security are we going to guarantee Ukraine? What kind of security will there be for Moldova? What kind of security will there be for Georgia? And thus, we really need to look at the question of some sort of European security program that takes into account the security needs of these different countries and rejects the idea that any country Russia or the United States has a right to declare spheres of influence. Elise, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, that's 4 minutes and 18 seconds. You go, brother. I'm asking to remind you, friends, that family, that you can access this webinar on Facebook live at the hashtag link there. And also that, and something just went up on the page, so I have to page up and see if I can catch that again. Yes. And we want to encourage you to put questions into the Q&A chat if you want to have your questions. We have some lined up, but if we don't cover them, jot them down and get them in there now. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Bill. Lots to think about there. Again, I'm going to move on to Sarah Nelson. Sister President Sarah, will you introduce our guest of honor, Captain Dennis Tager, while you're sharing on your 5 minutes, and you can give us 5. You're muted.
Wouldn't you know it? Okay. Captain Dennis Tager, make sure that you don't make the same mistake. You will hear what will sound like a voice of God, and you'll forgive me for this, Dennis. It'll be appropriate because pilots often think of themselves. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to say it. So no, very grateful to be on here, and very grateful that Captain Tager and my good friend Dennis decided to join us here. Let me just start here. This is immediately, let me just go to the realities of how this affects union members right now today, who are working, even US union members here right now. The flight planning that has to go on, not flying over Russian airspace, means that flights to Asia or to India are oftentimes running out of fuel because they're taking longer, they're having to stop, they're timing out, they're staying away from their families longer. So there are very practical things going on that are affecting union members who are going to work every single day today, not to mention the fact that, this is a little disconcerting when people are going to work and flying around and we're in the middle of these aggressions that we can't predict, and we don't know what is going to happen next. So this is, people go to work with a little more angst around that, of course. And also, we don't know what the next move is going to be. I should just say that I had the privilege of getting a briefing from General Milley recently. And, he, one of the things he said is no sudden moves right now. We're dealing with someone who we can't count on will make good decisions. And so we have to be very cautious not to escalate anything, because we could all be in a real world of hurt very quickly if that happens. And I know that a lot of people have talked about or thrown around the terms of enforcing a no-fly list almost glibly. And we have to understand the seriousness of that and what that would mean. And Dennis is going to help explain this to us. He also has a background. He's not just a commercial airline captain. He also is a veteran and can speak with some real clarity about what this can look like and what that actually means. And so no one is for, let me be very clear, no one is for enforcing no-fly zone because of what that would mean in terms of an immediate escalation to a place that puts everyone in jeopardy. So I want to express also that our union passed a resolution, and we are wearing blue and yellow ribbons behind our union pin when we go to work, really in support of the people of Ukraine and in support of the people of Russia who have protested and taken put their own lives on the line to protest their government and to call for peace. So I want to hand this over to Dennis now to bring some more color around what we know would happen very quickly in this conflict, in this war, if we were attempting to enforce a no-fly zone. And Dennis may have some other color to bring as well. Dennis?
Thank you, Madam President. It's an honor to be with such forward-thinking fellow union brothers and sisters. I'm a union pilot and proud of that for 30 plus years. Prior to that, I was 6 years in the U.S. Air Force, and I was involved in, as Sarah talks about, the no-fly zone, from Desert Storm and Desert Calm, I think is what the slogan or the campaign was called. So I'm not the modern day expert on it, but I sure have flown it. And it does sound, for those who think of it, and you hear the call for it, I'm not a policymaker, nor am I involved in any senior military activity at this point, but I can tell you from history, it's a full-on military activity. The no-fly zone, my experience in Iraq, a bit different than this one. All the aircraft were generally contained in Iraq, and we had domination over the airspace and on the ground. So you have to sort of mind map what that might look like. Granted, we're not making that decision, but as we hear our leadership, whether it be red or blue, when it comes to war, we don't identify parties. They're going to have to deal with, much like when this call started, you don't know what it's like until you get out there and do it. Everybody has a plan until the first punch is landed. So executing a no-fly zone can be complicated. And how do you enforce that? The ultimate enforcement is aircraft are shot down. That is try to avoid that at all, at as many tactical ways as possible. But ultimately, that's the idea of a no-fly zone. So we have to grapple with that reality. And as Sarah mentioned, and General Milley, I'm sure, has voiced, once that paste is out of the tube, it's real hard to get it back in. So a lot of tactical issues. It's from a human being level, it's anything we can do to keep human beings alive. Unfortunately, in war, people become human creatures, and a lot of things are done, and horrific results are rendered. So Sarah asked me to address that. I'd be happy to answer any questions from my experience, again, with the caveat that I am not the expert in that tactical maneuver, but I have lived it. One thing I want to mention with, and I know
Yeah,
we're
I was
maybe short on
going
time,
to
but I
say,
want
Dennis, when we were talking earlier about the humanitarian efforts afterwards, and also the fact that while this is not as much, not immediately a concern, we also have to recognize that there may be humanitarian efforts going on, and enforcing a no-fly zone also may get in the way of that. So that is another issue to consider. But I want to get back to you, Dennis, and I think you're about to say what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, obviously we want to be involved. Airlines are often, through craft or other efforts, our airlines are involved. Therefore, the workers are involved in ensuring that we do all that we can to take care of the humanitarian, the human crisis there. So as union members, we have to be deeply involved in how our corporations, our companies are engaging in that. We've learned, I'll mention Venezuela, where particularly an American, we had to say, no, we're not flying there. There were SA-7s and 6s, Russian missiles that threatened us, and the State Department was very clear of the threat. There are times where the unions have to step up and say, this is not a parochial issue for our members beyond just their safety, and say no. So we've got to keep our guard up. We've got to watch our companies. While there's an altruistic partnership in that, I'm certain of it, sometimes commercial interests creep in. And for instance, Wizz Air, we're very connected with the pilots there. They're an airline that left their people in country in Ukraine, hiding from the bombings. This particular company has connections to the US. It's an Indigo partner. Bottom line is actually one of American Airlines' executive vice presidents in charge of government affairs and legal affairs is on their board of directors. This is not an attack on that. This is the awareness that the tentacles of this run underground and all over the place. And unions, I'm proud to say I'm part of one that looks for all those connections to make sure that we're also protecting our members from undue threat that can be the result of overeager companies, perhaps for commercial interests, or have just lost their way. So checks and balances, trust but verify, and I'm sure we can be a positive force in this. Thank you. I yield my time, which is, I'm sure, over.
Thank you, Dennis. Back to you, Elise.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Sarah, very much. It's giving me a lot to think about, just taking in that information. Okay, Carl, you're on next, brother, president.
Thank you, Elise, and thank you everyone who spoken so far and put a lot of thought-provoking ideas out there. My job is to kind of talk very directly about what labor's stake is in war and in being opposed to war. And this comes from our history with U.S. labor against the war, which I heard a little bit about earlier. So, the obvious statement basically said is that war is bad for the working class in general, and this war certainly is. Bombs are falling on the heads of people throughout Ukraine. The people that the bombs are falling on the head of very much are members of the working class, and that's who's getting hit. That's government hasn't been able to get out of harm's way. The soldiers on both sides you can be sure, are predominantly drawn from the working class. The destruction that is taking place, the destruction that's taking place in Ukraine right now is going to lower the working class living standards in that country and perhaps in surrounding areas for many years to come until things are rebuilt. And yet, on the other side, there's a plus equation for some people monetarily. There are some folks profiting from this. You've got the weapons corporations on both sides, our fabled military-industrial complex, and the oil companies, the Western oil companies and the Middle Eastern oil companies who are going to greatly profit by the fact that this achieved actually one of the strategic goals of American foreign policy for some time, which is to get Europe off of Russian gas and oil. And now that's been accelerated if you've been watching the deals that have been being made. And so there's big money involved. So I know we're not looking to go deep into who started what and for what reasons here fully, but you can't look at any of this without realizing that there are economic motives. There always are in this world in a capitalist system. And along those lines, military spending itself is properly seen as a theft from human needs, and in particular from the needs of the working class. Every dollar that's spent on weapons is not spent on goods that could actually help improve the living standards of the working class. And we see it very concretely right now in the United States. They are increasing, it's like every week there's another of money tied into this war. There's a further increase proposal for our military budget, et cetera. Yet at the same time, money not going to social programs. Build Back Better has not even been brought forth, for a vote, which has really important social programs for the American people. They aren't even funding right now COVID protections that are going to be needed as yet another variant starts to enter this country. And who's going to suffer first? People without insurance. And who are those folks? Those are the members of the working class that don't have insurance in this country overwhelmingly. And they aren't going to be able to get vaccines and test for free pretty soon. And then the other impact that was mentioned a bit, but I want to talk about it particularly in terms of the working class is what's happening to the climate. I mean, there's absolute generational harm being done here in terms of environmental stuff. Every war zone that opens, both to the people who are in proximity to it as it's happening and what they're breathing in, et cetera, but also what's left on the land. And we also know that the US military is the biggest single polluter in the world, and it's the biggest user of fossil fuels in the world. And now, as everybody else gets in here with these militaries at full throttle, that's happening. So it's not only creating additional crisis for our climate and for our environment, but it's also, again, dragging money away that ought to be being spent on fixing our climate issues. And we know that it's the working class that disproportionately is harmed through climate change. They're going to be the ones who are least able to get away from its effects and most likely lose their homes, et cetera. So the framework we have to understand here is that we have elites who are starting these wars, but the working class who are paying for them with their dollars and their lives and their living standards. And that's why labor needs to have an independent position on foreign policy. We cannot allow ourselves to be tied to what the US foreign policy establishment is saying should go. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be tied to what either political party is saying should go. We're the ones who need to forward the working class perspective on these issues. And I'd also say labor knows something about how to resolve conflict and how to bring this war to an end, because we know that when we're in conflict with our employers, while we are obviously trying to find ways to have leverage, we also can't resolve anything without talking. And so it seems to me that here in the United States, our job as US unionists is to get our government, the US government, to fully focus on getting the parties to negotiate an immediate end to the thing. That's what needs to happen. And we need the Biden administration to be fully focused on that and not fanning fires with rhetoric or more weapons or saber rattling or anything else. There has to be a drumbeat of insistence. Get to the table and get this done. So, man, as labor needs to be negotiate, not escalate.
Thank you, Carl. I don't know if you can close down some other programs, so you're breaking up a little bit there at the end. We heard most of everything you said, but right at the end, we were having a little lag there. So,
okay, I'll repeat my last couple points then, which is, and sorry about that. I'm on a hard line.
It's a little staggered. It's not completely garbled.
Okay, the Biden administration needs to be pushing both sides hard to the table. That should be their main focus. They need to be doing that rather than fanning the fires with rhetoric or with more weapons or with saber rattling. And our demand as labor needs to be negotiate, not escalate.
Thank you, Carl. Also, I want to thank you.
Elise, you just muted yourself.
I've never heard, I thank you for the awareness, because one of the big ahas I got here was about the whole impact on the climate. And I literally had not heard that information about, and I mean, it makes sense that the military is the biggest polluters out there. I mean, it's like, okay, so that's a lot to think about. I know there's some questions. So I'm going to start with the first question that I got from, that we got from people who responded earlier who were coming in. And this is the question. What is the likeliest end game for this war? And what should the U.S. role be in reaching it? You talked about it a little bit, Carl, but I'm gonna go to Bill and Phyllis and ask you to, what's the likeliest end game for this war and what should the U.S. role be in reaching it? Bill?
I'm going to defer to Phyllis and then I'll reply after that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Phyllis?
You know, every war ends with negotiations. Sometimes it's a negotiation of the terms of the surrender. Sometimes the better times are negotiations instead of a fight to the finish. The question is always, how many more people have to die? How many more cities will be destroyed? How much more land will be destroyed? How much more food for the world will not be available? How many trillions of dollars will be wasted before we get to the negotiations? So I think the most likely thing is that there will be negotiations. I think we saw the beginnings of it today, although the war is continuing, as was true in Vietnam and other wars, of course. The wars continue as if there were no talks. The talks continue as if there were no war. That's a longstanding, horrifying reality, but it is a reality. I think that what we're talking about is the need, and Carl mentioned this, that the US needs to support the diplomacy. We need to hear from US officials what we did not hear, for example, in the Iraq War, that sanctions will be lifted when the war ends, so that there is an incentive to end the war. The alternative to that is to say, well, we have to make sure that every act that Russia claims will be irreversible before we will end the sanctions. That says you're not serious about negotiating, because that is impossible to prove. So I think we have to push the US even harder to support the diplomacy. What we were hearing yesterday and today, I found very disturbing. Voices from Washington saying, well, this is a lot of talk, but we don't think it's serious. We don't believe the Russians. The Russians have lied before. Yes, of course they've lied before. They lied when they said they wouldn't invade, and then they did invade. So yeah, they've lied. The US has lied. Lots of countries lie. That's not the basis for saying we can't have negotiations. You negotiate with your enemies. Those are the most important negotiations. So I think what we need to push for is a recognition that negotiations need to be supported. We don't need to hear more voices saying, well, we're not really sure if this is going to work. In fact, it was the leading US general, who is the general in charge of the US European Command, who said, when the Ukrainian military said, we are seeing small pullbacks from the two key cities that Russia said they would withdraw from. They haven't withdrawn, they're not withdrawing, but they are pulling back some. It was noticeable to the Ukrainians. In Washington, the voices were, well, we don't believe it. We don't think that's really true. The general on the ground said, this is exactly what I'm seeing. So there's a real divide, as has been the case in other wars, most notably Libya around the no-fly zone, a real divide between the military, who was saying no, and the diplomats, ironically, who were saying yes to a no-fly zone with catastrophic results. So I think that in this case, ironically, it was the general who was playing a more important diplomatic role, saying what he saw. He saw that there was at least a small scale pullback. You want to support that. You don't want to say, well, we don't care about that. It's not good enough. The war isn't going to end with one session of negotiations. The war isn't going to end with one diplomatic meeting. It's going to take time, unfortunately, and more people will die. The question is, how do we make that number as small as possible? That's our job.
Elise, if I can just say one thing about this.
Go ahead, Bill.
I'm in agreement with Phyllis, for sure. There's going to be an implication from this war that many people are ignoring, which is that this war disincentivizes small countries from giving up nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. Because the Budapest Accords of 1994 that the Ukrainians signed led to them turning over all of their nuclear weapons. They were the third largest possessor of nuclear weapons on the planet. They turned them over to the Russians on the condition that they would never be attacked by Russia. And in 2014, they were attacked by Russia. And then again, they've been attacked by Russia now. So from the standpoint of small countries, why should they believe big countries? You know, and this is going to be something that will haunt the negotiations that Phyllis mentioned that are necessary to resolve this conflict, that the Budapest Accords were very clear and they were broken. So the question from the standpoint of the Ukrainians is, what guarantee do they have that this will not happen again? And this is one of the reasons that there's a larger European security issue that needs to be examined here. And certainly the United States should not be playing a provocative role, but should be helping to guarantee such a security arrangement.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna put the next one to Sarah and Dennis and Carl, and then I have a specific question for Dennis. But right now, I just want to ask. This is a question that's been asked. What can we do to get unions to embrace and advocate for a working class view of foreign policy instead of relying on corporate media talking points?
I'm going to start here, Elise. Okay.
President.
And I'm going to make it really simple. We have to organize. So there's 90% of workers who are not in unions today. You can't have any kind of dialogue with people who are not actually in the union hall. So we need to get out and organize. And let me just start there, and then I'm going to kick it to Dennis and Carl to talk more specifically about the question. But we have to meet this moment if we're going to have a chance. And let me also be clear too, that unions are where people trust their information. So we are letting down the public, and we are part of the problem if we are not getting out there and organizing like never before and putting all of our resources into that. because this is the one place where you can have a conversation where it's not a self-selecting entity that remains anywhere in our country. And people come with different views and different backgrounds, and oftentimes you come up with better solutions because of that. But the only way that we are going to really make the most out of that is to have an engaged, mobilized current labor movement. Think about the 13 million that could organize the rest. That is nothing to sneeze at, and we can do it. And it is absolutely paramount that we do it. Our democracy depends on it. This is the one place where we can have real conversations and believe in each other.
Thank you, Sarah. Carl, Bennis.
I would never argue with the idea that we need to go out and organize the unorganized. That is absolutely true. But we have real resources right now within the labor movement and can make our voice heard. And part of the problem, this was the fight that U.S. labor against the war led, 20 years ago, was to get labor to have an independent voice on this and say the working class has a stake in these war and peace issues, and we're gonna voice that. And it was several years of struggle, but we actually moved most of the labor, and it took a lot of patient work. And it starts with education. So before this webinar ends, I'm going to lay out some concrete steps that people can take to begin that education process within their own locals, within their councils, within their national unions, et cetera. And it starts with discussion and bringing forth the ideas that are here, and because it is a huge problem. I mean, there has been a huge one-sided media approach to this war that we haven't seen, it more so even than with the Iraq war. And it's not to say that it's not correct. Russia should not have invaded, right? But we have never seen the people whose homes are getting bombed and the people are getting displaced like we have in this war. And I think a lot of people have commented on the fact that maybe it's because they're white people, right? And maybe it's because the media is used to being in Europe. But we did a lot of, what do you think shock and awe was in Iraq? I mean, we were doing to Baghdad what the Russians are doing to cities in Ukraine, and it was inexcusable in both cases. So right now, most people are very susceptible to what the warmongers amongst the politicians are running around with, which is we can't stand for this, right? We have to do the no-fly zone. We have to maybe even send ground troops in. We have to do regime change in Russia. All of these things that are just going to create a global conflagration, and we have to do the education within the labor movement to then get the labor movement making a demand on the elected officials to stop this and to force people to the table instead. And the other part is, we're going to have to help rebuild the peace movement because that's part of our problem. There's USLAW is bringing the labor movement to the peace movement. There isn't much of a peace movement right now to bring it to, which is also why there's not as much of a peace movement within the labor movement. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Carl. So Dennis, I have a question that's come from the audience that's directly for you. Can I go to that instead, or did you want to answer this one too?
No, absolutely. And I have a little color to put on that too, but give me the question.
Okay.
And Elise, I'll just remind everyone, because I know some people were saying this, Dennis does not have his video on, so it's going to look like there's a voice coming out of nowhere. I just want to remind people of that. That's normal, but he is joining us the best way he possibly can tonight, and we really appreciate him being here. So go ahead.
We suspect he's on the tarmac waiting to get on a jet plane, but we're not sure because we know there was a lot of noise in the background earlier. But Dennis, if you want to hit that question real quick, go ahead, and then I'll go to the one that the audience has specifically for you.
Sure, and it's bandwidth. I've got thin bandwidth here, and I know if I'm in video, it'll make it choppy. Plus,
thank you, brother.
Yes, but there was a comment made, and I served in Desert Storm, and I must say this on behalf of my brothers and sisters that fought that war, and not to pick one side or the other, but we didn't do what the Russians are doing. We didn't bomb apartment buildings and shelters where people were trying to stay away from what was going on. Did unintended targets happen? But I must say that I lived that, and I have no heavy weight on my heart because of what was just stated there. So I'm just obligated to say that. And in talking about the military industrial complex, I'm as jaded on it as anyone. I mean, I've been involved. I encourage everybody to check out a Netflix documentary, Downfall, the case against Boeing, about what a corporation gone awry ended up doing, losing 346 souls. That being said, as someone who has served and my son has served, if and when our elected officials decide that they're going to be utilized to defend our interests, whether the debate on the interest is there or not, you don't really care. Your job is to just take care of what you've been ordered to do. You're not unthinking. There are legal orders, but you want the best and the most amount of weaponry on your side. And that's something, and I say this not in opposition to what we're talking about. I am I'm viciously against war. But if you're going to avoid that, you've got to have some strength. And I just want to make sure that in messaging that you may consider the union message is there, but being a deep outlier in it, when, as someone mentioned on this call, and boy, are they right, I'm from blue collar trade union, was raised and went into the military. If you're on the side of right, but you're exemplifying a message that goes to an area that may make some folks retract, you may lose an ally in your messaging, whether or not they're union or not. But I yield on that. Please give me another question so I can stop my rant.
This is from audience, and then Phyllis, I see you had a comment. I'm going to come back to you. So Dennis, the question is, why not fly to Venezuela?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. And it was brought up, the previous speaker, I apologize not knowing names, said, we need to get a no-fly zone. All the reasons that Sarah talked about, General Milley, I've likely relayed. These are escalation issues, and they can go, like I said, once the paste is out of the tube, it's hard to get it back in. Venezuela, American Airlines was one of the few carriers, U.S. carriers, flying in there. It had a presence there. And when it was no longer safe and the State Department were actually evacuating families, our company was still attempting to fly revenue flights in and out of there. The threat became so large to us, with State Department warnings and intelligence of Soviet missiles that could take out an aircraft, a civilian aircraft, that our union took a strong stand and said, no, we're not flying it. I was involved in the communication of that, and it stood. And management was not pleased with it. They tried to assure us that it was safe, but we had boots on the ground and we had people in country that were telling us an entirely different story. We prevailed, and they ceased flying there. And we kept not only union members safe, but those passengers who are depending on those union members. Hey, if they're going in, it must be safe. Well, we couldn't make that pledge to them, honestly. So we ceased operations. And that's the strength of a union, when it's united and it's standing behind keeping people safe. And in the aviation business, there's very little room for error in that. So it was difficult and it was nerve-wracking. If you think taking action, as Sarah Nelson can attest to, and talking about, no, we're not going to do that, and then you stop it and you tell your members to stop it and they comply, you lose a little sleep over the night. Did I do the right thing? And then the answer to this one was yes.
Thank you, Dennis. All right, Phyllis, you want to hit on the Iraq issue?
I'm sorry, but Dennis, I just want to take issue with the broader version of you spoke to your own experience, and I recognize that and I appreciate that. But the question for me during the war in Iraq was the safety of Iraqis. I was in Iraq in the in-between years, the sanctioned years, after the 1991 war and before the 2003 invasion. And I saw, among other things, the Amaria shelter, where hundreds of people were killed by a direct US bombing assault. We've seen through the exposés that have come out since then of direct attacks. This is not the place for us to argue the legitimacy or lack thereof of the Iraq war, only to say that the numbers of people killed, the destruction of whole cities. I mean, and we're just talking Iraq, we're not talking about Syria, about the destruction of Raqqa and others. I think it's a huge mistake for us to claim that our wars are somehow cleaner than others' wars. Wars are horrific, and ours have been as well. The numbers of civilians killed. The US dropped far more bombs in the first day of Desert Storm than have been dropped in the first week in Ukraine. That doesn't make the Ukraine war better. It's an illegal, horrific invasion. Ours was as well. And I just think we need to own that. It's not about what each individual soldier did, or airman or sailor, but the impact of our war on Iraq was a devastation that I think our country needs to maintain our accountability to.
And I would be in full agreement. In war, innocent people are killed, and that's why we have to do everything we can to prevent it. So I respect that counter, and certainly recognize that those things happen. So thank you for that. And this is a healthy conversation where people on both sides can have can reconcile and come to a conclusion that war is an ugly, ugly beast.
Yes, it is. And we all concur on that one. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you, Dennis. I have 9 more questions here, and we're at 9 o'clock. So I'm going to move along, but now we're getting to this myth busting phase of this. So someone asked the question, there have been reports that Zelensky and the Ukrainian government have bombed their own cities in eastern Ukraine. Is this true? Is the loss of the eastern region of Russia likely, and if so, what are the geopolitical implications of a divided Ukraine? Okay, who wants to take a stab at that one? You say yes or no?
I'll
Bill,
take a
I'll
stab at
go
it.
with you first, Phyllis. Go ahead.
I'll take a stab at it. I'm not on the ground, so I can't say who's bombing who. I think it's really unlikely that the government of Ukraine is bombing their own cities. It's not impossible. It's not like that's never happened in history, but I see no evidence that makes that have any shred of logic. I don't see any way that the government of Ukraine would benefit from this. I think it's a separate question, the possibility of some kind of a divide of what is now Ukrainian territory. I don't think that's impossible. It won't be the first time that's happened in the context of ending a war. It's not a good outcome, but it is certainly a possible outcome if we look particularly at this notion of waiting 15 years to negotiate the final status of the Donbass region, for instance, which is apparently something that was on the table yesterday. That would mean technically a change if the Donbass, for example, were to be autonomous in a way that was different from other regions of the country. That would mean a kind of divide. The question of Crimea, would that be recognized at some point by a government in Ukraine? It isn't now. Might it be? It's certainly possible. But I think linking that would be only possible if the Ukrainian government was somehow bombing itself, bombing its own people. I just don't see any evidence of that.
Okay. Thank you, Phyllis. Bill.
I agree. And what it reminds me of is that there's a lot of rumor mongering that's going on, just as there was after 9/11, when the truthers began spreading these ideas about what actually happened to the Twin Towers. And the problem is that many of these rumors can fit what people wish to believe to be the story. We see this absolutely all the time with the Trumpsters, but it also happens in segments of the progressive community. I think we have to be very careful about the conclusions that we draw, and look up in depth into what's actually happening. The other thing is that in the immediate, in the advent of the war, there were people in the United States, progressives, who were basically telling the Ukrainians what they were going to have to do in order to settle. In other words, they were saying, well, you're going to have to give up Crimea and give up the Donbass regions. And it's like, this is so typical American. It's so damn chauvinist. It's like, here we are sitting and we're going to say, this is what you're going to have to do. I mean, as Phyllis was saying, they're going to have to negotiate. This is not going to be easy. And more than likely, the Russians are going to demand some land. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but we need to be siding on, with those that are respecting self-determination and sovereignty, and not acting as if, that we can proclaim what the final settlement should be.
Elise, if I could just add one thing to
Sure,
this.
Carl, go for it.
So, there's a couple truisms about war, and we already is hell. And I think that's what we were just talking about before. War is hell. And if a war gets started, it's going to be hell for the people involved. And there is a fog of war where you don't really know what's going on. And even those people who are participating in it don't necessarily know what's going on and who they're affecting. And there are, I don't think there's a lot of point to be made of exactly who shot who. There's a lot of shooting going on. There's some brutal people on both sides. It shouldn't have been unleashed. And it was the Russian invasion that unleashed us at this time. Of course, it's in the context of there had already been a fight going on in Eastern Ukraine for quite a while with apparently, a good number of thousands of people killed there over the years with, again, shooting taking place from both sides. That's why our job as a movement is to help stop war. And that's where our focus needs to be. Where we are now, we need to be pushing hard to negotiate, not escalate.
Perfect. Well said, Carl. Thank you very much. Okay, so this is another a myth that's out there. I don't know if it's a myth.
And if can I interrupt for Carl just said something as prior service, you hit it dead on, the fog of war, and others have made comment. You don't have to live it to understand that, and you obviously understand that. And the saying goes, the first casualty in war is the truth, and you just have to be cynically aware of that. So thank you for those comments. I deeply appreciate it as a veteran.
Thank you, Dennis. All righty, here's the next one. What about allegations that the U.S. deliberately trapped Russia into this war in order to weaken Putin? Anybody?
No.
No, absolutely not.
What she said.
It was a very effective trap if that was intentional. It's something maybe 40 years from now they'll be able to, know for sure whether that's the case or not.
Putin has
But
done.
Russia launched this war. They should, if it was bait, they shouldn't have taken it. That's for damn sure.
Okay, Bill, Phyllis, I think you both want to say something, right?
Putin has done a remarkable job to strengthen NATO. We couldn't have asked for a better plan to strengthen NATO. At a point when there's various movements that have been challenging NATO and it's challenging militarism, he did a remarkable job. I mean, he'll get an award for it somewhere, for actually strengthening NATO. And so if he got trapped, he was a fool. I think that it's better to look at the nature of the Putin regime and to understand the dynamics there, the white supremacy, the homophobia, the religious intolerance, the aggressiveness. Go interview some Chechens and ask them about Putin and the question of democracy. And then I think we get a better sense as to the factors that have contributed to this. And yes, there were provocations. We've talked about them. But the idea that the Russians got trapped, I mean, I think that, Putin's a bit crazy, but I don't think he's a fool.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bill. Phyllis.
Yeah, I agree with that, with what Bill just said. I also think, though, that it's important for us, it is important for us to sort of understand what are the range of motivations that may have been operative. I don't think we know exactly which ones. I don't think we can weigh, was it more about the NATO expansion or more about the view that Ukraine is not a separate country? I mean, all of these things were part of what led Putin to this invasion. But I think now we do have our primary obligation to do whatever we can to push our government to support a diplomatic solution. And I think we have to look to the future. because while I don't believe that this was in response to a deliberate trap set by the US, I do think that the US is taking advantage of it in very dangerous ways, which has to do with things like what Germany has announced, that they are now going to, for the first time, agree to pay 2% of their GDP, which is a huge amount of money, more than they've ever put before, into the military, which will have enormous consequences on working people in Germany in terms of the power of their unions, in terms of issues of healthcare and jobs and all of that. We have countries like the neutral countries of Finland and Sweden, who for the first time are talking about joining NATO. It will strengthen NATO, as Bill was just saying. The US is thrilled about that because when countries join NATO, they start to buy more US weapons because of this notion of interoperability of NATO, right? All the weapons have to be able to work together. What does that mean? It means people like the CEO of Raytheon, who said a couple of weeks before the invasion, we're a little worried, he said this to a group of shareholders, we're a little worried about the US withdrawal from Afghanistan because, God forbid, they're not going to be buying quite as many weapons, but we're encouraged by some news from Eastern Europe. That was his line. He's cheerleading for the war because it's good for their bottom line. So it's the taking advantage of this war that I think we need to be focused on more than was there a trap set.
Oh boy. Oh boy. Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I got my thinking cap on now. So next up, we're going to switch it a bit because people have been asking this question a lot. What are the short and long-term implications for the future use of fossil fuels as a result of this war? Who would like to take a stab at that one? Anybody?
I'll just offer this.
So,
Oh,
go ahead.
I'll offer this one point. And then let me also just say that my no before is about being, because we had an incredible conversation off of that question that was really, I think, very helpful to the overall discussion. But the reason that I simply said no is because we have to clear out the things that are distractions. And so that we can focus on what needs to be done, which is where we got to in the answer there, and holding our government accountable and making sure that we don't have corporations doing that we are doing that as workers. So in terms of fossil fuels, the one thing that I would say is that this can be an opportunity if we decide to make it one, because we can encourage a faster attempt to make ourselves not have to be as reliable on fossil fuels. So this is an opportunity if we want to take it. And Carl will talk about, I assume Carl will talk about the other side of this, but let me just offer that. And I know that in the airline industry, especially, that is being talked about right now.
Thank you, Sarah. Carl?
I'm fine passing at this point and letting somebody else tackle it. That's all right.
Okay, no problem. Anybody else on the issue of fossil
I'll
fuels?
jump in with a couple of points. I'm not a climate expert, but I know some things. One is that the point that Sarah raised is the crucial point, which is using this as an opportunity to cut back on our dependence on fossil fuels, that dependency itself fuels these wars. The dependence of Europe on Russian oil and gas has been a huge point of contention over these years. Mm-hmm. But we're not seeing that. We're seeing efforts now, we're seeing an effort to rehabilitate the horrific government of Saudi Arabia in the hopes that the US is going to be able to convince them to break with OPEC and produce more oil to lower the price on the world market, so that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, MBS, who is widely understood to have been responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, as among other things, as well as orchestrating the slaughter of people across Yemen, the poorest people, the working people of Yemen, who have faced a horrific war at the hands of the Saudis and the UAE. He's being rehabilitated to being the champion of who's going to lower oil prices for us. Mm-hmm. You know, this is incredibly dangerous. How it's taking advantage of this to carry out these other goals, and it's a really dangerous move.
Thank you, Phyllis. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question. Oh, I'm sorry. Carl, you want to come back? You thought about it?
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that taking advantage thing. I will tell you at a personal level, when I heard the news the night that Russia invaded, I had the same horrific sinking feeling in my stomach that I did when I was hearing the reports on 9/11, because I knew how badly it was going to distort our politics in the U.S. and internationally, and how it was going to, put us into kind of a dark ages where the most reactionary forces were going to ride that wave to go even further in the direction of might makes right and repressing civil liberties, which means repressing the labor movement and the people's movements in general. And so I am very concerned with what Phyllis is saying, that these things are being taken advantage of, and so it makes me even angrier at Putin for having done this, I guess is what I would say, that and so it has that negative effect on climate change too as part of it.
Okay, this might be our next to last question, but how best can we support the Ukraine resistance without supporting NATO?
I think the most important thing is to support and demand that our government support negotiations that are serious, and that they make clear that they will support that diplomatic process, so that it's not about sending more stingers or more whatever. That's going to extend the war. It's about making sure that those negotiations start and that they're taken seriously, and that it brings this war to a faster close, not an extended close.
Okay, thank you, Phyllis. Bill?
Yeah, I'm going to give a different answer. I think we take no position on the Ukrainians obtaining weapons from whoever they need to obtain them from. This is a war. They've been attacked. They have the right of self-defense. They have a right to take down their opponent. We need to be demanding of the United States and of Russia a settlement of this conflict, which necessitates the Russians withdrawing from Ukraine. But I think we need to be careful. If you're in an alley and someone bigger than you is attacking you, and someone on the side is saying, you two should stop fighting, and you're in the middle of getting your rear end kicked, I mean, it's a question of, well, do you stop fighting while someone has their fist in your face, or do you both have to walk away? And so I think we have to be very careful. The Ukrainians are fighting back. They need to fight back. The Russians obviously assumed that they could march into Ukraine with little resistance. And I think that they're being learned something, as some people would say.
So if I can just add to that,
Sure, Carl.
clearly the Ukrainian people have the right to defend themselves, and as part of that, they will, like any country, try to procure weapons wherever they can. My caution is based on a long and sordid history of the U.S. pumping weapons in war zones. Those weapons end up in the hands of all kinds of folks. And there's all kinds of folks in Ukraine right now on both sides, because, a lot of the weapons end up on the other side too. And, every anti-aircraft missile some of them are going to end up shooting down other planes at some point. It won't be just Russian fighter jets that get shot. And it may be years from now, and it may be in another country, and it may even be an American plane, and it could be a civilian plane that gets shot down. So I think, just from kind of that practical point of view of looking at what's happened when U.S. has supplied weapons into other war zones, we really need to think about that. That's different than the question of how should the Ukrainian people fight the war that they are called to fight at this point.
Thank you, Carl. Okay, we're at 9:18, and I think we're supposed to close at 9:30. Is that correct? Am I correct? Okay, alrighty. So the couple of big questions still that just got sent in, and okay, I'll just go for it. So a couple of panelists have mentioned the need for a new system of European security that would include Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and Russia. What would that new architecture of security look like, and how would that change NATO? You're laughing, Carl. Did you put that question in the chat room?
I didn't, but I'm looking forward to Phyllis's answer. I want to know.
Phyllis?
Well, there is an answer that already exists. It needs to be re-strengthened, and that is, it's called the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which involves all of Western Europe, all the NATO countries, and Ukraine and Russia, pretty much everybody in Europe, plus of course Canada and the US, who always think they have to be in every regional body. But it involves everybody. And it's not a military alliance, it's a political alliance. It's rooted very much like the European Union in some ways. It talks about human rights. It has human rights monitors that have been on the ground. One of the first things that happened in Ukraine years ago was pulling out the OSCE monitors, unfortunately. So I think there's the basis for it there. It's going to take some strong restructuring of the whole security architecture, partly because all of the arms control treaties, the treaties calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons, getting nuclear weapons out of Europe altogether. The US pulled out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement under Trump. Right now there are almost no functioning disarmament or arms control treaties controlling any of this stuff in Europe. So it's a very dangerous moment. And it goes directly to Carl's point a minute ago about the consequences when more arms get flooded into a country. It's not about, do individual peoples, in this case, do the Ukrainians have a right to defend themselves? Yes, they do. And those of us who are outside need to understand the desperation that leads people to ask for things like a no-fly zone, knowing how dangerous that could be. And yet, we have to sometimes say no. This happened in Libya, where some of the Libyans called for a no-fly zone. Others said, don't do it, we can do it ourselves. The US did it, pushed by NATO, other NATO countries, particularly Italy in that case, and went along with it. And it left Libya devastated, far worse than it had been before. In Afghanistan in the 1980s, when the US went in to arm the opposition against the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, we know what that led to, the creation of Al-Qaeda and all that has led to. So the consequences are huge, and you can't simply, in my view, say they have a right to self-defense and therefore anybody who wants to send them arms should, despite the fact that we know, as Carl said, what the consequences will be. We can't afford to put aside those consequences.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Elise.
Bill, I know you got something. Go ahead.
When the Vietnamese were being blasted to hell by the United States, there were many of us that were absolutely enthusiastic about the Soviet Union and China providing the Vietnamese with weapons. You didn't have to agree with the Soviet or the Chinese system. You had to agree that there was genocide being committed against the Vietnamese people, the Laotians and the Cambodians. The problem in a very practical way right now is that the Ukrainians are facing the armed aggression of the Russians. And we can say they have a right to resist, but if they don't have guns, if they don't have ways of knocking out these tanks and planes, then what does this mean about a right to resist? I think that there are great dangers that are always inherent in war, and that's one of the reasons we've got to try to avoid them. So one of the things in looking at the future of Europe, I think has to be a denuclearization. This is a time for a renewal of the anti-nuclear movement. And because we're seeing how close, it's like, I think people have gotten very comfortable with that doomsday clock. It's like, a few minutes before midnight, and people say, yeah. But now it's like, wow, it's like, we understand this could blow at any moment. And so there needs to be a denuclearization. And that means building and sustaining an anti-nuclear movement. But we also have to be, as a so-called peace movement, the people that are upholding self-determination, the people who are standing against aggression. It's not just being in opposition to war. We've got to be in favor of justice.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Okay, Sarah, do you want to say something real quick, or Dennis, before I turn it back over to Carl, who's going to wrap it up for us?
No, I just want to, I want to share, actually, I hope you don't mind, Dennis. I got this text. This is a good panel, some same goal, to stop war, and all of us coming possibly from different paths and arriving at the same destination. And I just have to say, this has been extraordinary to listen to everyone tonight. And I want to thank Carl and everyone for bringing this together. I think it's really important, and I hope people continue to watch this afterwards in the archives.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Dennis.
No, Sarah capped it right off. It's been a pleasure and a healthy dialogue, not always comfortable, but the tough issues and getting to the best conclusion is always that way. So thank you for the opportunity to engage.
Right, and that is what dialogue is about. It's not about us all being lockstep in agreement. It's about us having discussion from both sides and whatever perspective we have, so that we're bringing real meaningful dialogue to what we're doing. Carl, you got something to say about the steps labor activists can take going forward?
I do. This is the answer to what is to be done. Okay, what is to be done as labor activists here. And so look, the number one point is get a conversation going in your union so that the education is taking place. And the best way to do that, whether it's at a local, a regional level, labor councils, conventions, wherever, the tried and true method is bring a resolution forward. It forces people to discuss the issue. We have a draft resolution. We have copies of resolutions that have already been passed by other union bodies. There's a resource page. Hopefully that's about to be put into the chat again. It's been up there several times, but it should be going in there again shortly. And there's going to be, by the way, a follow-up email for anybody who has registered, and you're going to get this information there too. But you can find that resource page, these various resolutions. You're also going to find the slideshow and music, great anti-war music that's with it. It's going to play as soon as we finish here. In just a couple minutes, it's going to play for about 15 minutes or so. Stick around and watch it if you want. You can also go at a later point and pick it up there, I believe. This webinar you can use. It's been recorded. We will get a link to that up on the resource page and probably emailed out also as soon as we can. And feel free, it's not copyrighted. Feel free to use all the parts of it to help people understand the issues that are going on. Keep yourself educated more than the average person by seeing a variety of news services on this. News sources. Subscribe to the Solidarity Info Service, which Michael Eisenschur, who's been putting a lot of these things in the chat, who was the national coordinator for a long time for U.S. Labor Against the War. He's continuing to do a great service to the labor movement, to the anti-war movement also. He sends that out weekly, and you'll find a whole variety of resources so you can really understand what all is going on. Talk to your elected officials, get a labor delegation together. When folks are on board, you get a resolution passed, take a couple people and call up your congressperson, say, we want to talk about this. We want you to speak out on this. This is really important to us. Write letters to the editor and op-ed pieces as a union person from a working class perspective. Put that message out there. And help revive the peace movement, both within the labor movement as well as in society as a whole. And you're seeing chats, you're seeing links, things in the chat that you can do. And we're going to put one more link in there, which is there are folks who want to make donations to help refugees, but do it through the labor movement. There is a path to do that. The International Trade Union Confederation has a direct pipeline in through some of the Ukrainian unions. And you can, if make a donation to them, our understanding is it will go through in that way. So hopefully everybody leaves here inspired to go out and help build a movement that can help bring this war and all wars to an end. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you all. Thanks to all of our panelists. Really appreciate the wisdom and strength and hope you've shared with us. Thanks to all of you who came to see this. And as we said, this will be available. The recording will be available. And I want to thank Justin Smith at the Institute for Policy Studies for being in the background, handling all the technical arrangements that made this webinar possible. And clearly, I'm looking at, there's like 42 questions in the question and answer queue, at least 24 of them. And we will want to get to all of it. That's the reason why we need to have another one of these, I think, y'all. And if there's a motion on the floor, I'll entertain that. Because obviously we could go on, and we need to go on, but we need to share more importantly. Carl said my magic word: education. Educate, educate, educate. Knowledge is power. And the rank and file, our families aren't getting this information from the mainstream media. It's only going to come from us. And then we have to be the ones to get out there and do it. So a link to the recording will be sent to everyone who registered and will be included in the resource document, the link for which has been posted at the chat several times during the webinar. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. They divide us by our color. They divide us by our tongue. They divide us men and women. They divide us old and young. But they'll tremble at our voices when they hear these verses sung. That the union has the backbone of democracy. The union has the capability and the power of all the folks who are involved in our unions to make this a more perfect union is the work that we are called to do. And that we understand that peace is possible and we will wage peace. The union makes us strong. Go in peace, go in love, go in solidarity forever. Thank you, family. You can unmute.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Elise.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. That's
Well,
wonderful.
Michael.
Stick around for
Thanks,
the video
Elise.
if you want.
Fantastic.
This
Thank
was
you,
great.
everyone.
Yeah,
Michael?
stick around for the music in the video. It's pretty good.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you all. It was wonderful. Great discussion.
I learned a lot.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing any music. Is this
There's
really music?
no Justin. There's no audio. There's a link. There were two versions of the file, one with audio and one without. You can go back and find the one with audio. Starts with Gil Scott Heron. Hard to beat that.
Just to be clear, the version with the audio is a video version. The resolution is not quite as good, but it's also available through the resource bank. There's a link there to it. Sorry about that.
Not a problem.
They're sure safe just to keep the job going in the arms-making workplace. And then they pretend to be gripped by some sort of political reflex. But all they're doing is paying dues to the military-industrial complex. The military and the monetary. Military and the monetary. Military and the monetary. The military and the monetary get together whenever they think it's necessary. They turn our brothers and sisters into mercenaries. They are turning the planet to a cemetery. The military and the monetary use the media as intermediaries. They are determined to keep the citizens secondary. They make so many decisions that are arbitrary. We're marching behind the commander-in-chief who was standing under a spotlight shaking like a leaf. But the ship of state had landed on an economic reef, so we knew he was going to bring us messages of grief. The military and the monetary were shielded by January and went storming into February. Brought us pot-bellied generals as luminaries. 2 weeks ago I hadn't heard of the sumbitch, now all of a sudden he's legendary. They took the honor from the honorary, they took the dignity from the dignitaries, they took the secrets from the secretary, but they left the bitch an obituary. The military and the monetary from thousands of miles away in a Saudi Arabian sanctuary had us all scrambling for our dictionaries because we couldn't understand the fucking vocabulary. Yeah, there were some smart bombs, but there were some dumb ones as well. Scared the hell out of CNN in that Baghdad hotel. The military and the monetary, they get together whenever they think it's necessary. War in the desert sometimes sure is scary, but they beamed out the war to all their subsidiaries, tried to make so damn insane a worthy adversary, keeping the citizens secondary, scaring old folks into coronaries. The military and the monetary from thousands of miles in a Saudi Arabian sanctuary kept us all wondering if all of this was really truly necessary. We've got to work for peace. Peace ain't coming this way. If we only work for peace, if everyone believed in peace the way they say they do, we'd have peace. The only thing wrong with peace is that you can't make no money from it. The military and the monetary, they get together whenever they think it's necessary. They've turned our brothers and sisters into mercenaries. They are turning the planet into a cemetery. We got to work for peace. Peace ain't coming this way. We should not allow ourselves to be misled by talk of entering a time of peace. Peace is not the absence of war, it is the absence of the rumors of war and the threats of war and the preparation for war. Peace is not the absence of war, it is the time when we will all bring ourselves closer to each other, closer to building a structure that is unique within ourselves because we have finally come to peace within ourselves. Military and the monetary, military and the monetary, military and the monetary. Get together whenever they think it's necessary. They have turned our brothers and sisters into mercenaries. They are turning parts of the planet into a cemetery. What you gonna do? Military and the monetary, military and the monetary. What you gonna do? We hounded the Ayatollah religiously, bombed Libya and killed Gaddafi's son hideously. We turned our back on our allies, the Panamanians, and saw Ali North selling guns to the Iranians. Watched Gorbachev slaughtering Lithuanians. We better warn the Amish, they may bomb the Pennsylvanians. The military, the monetary, get together whenever they're necessary. They have turned our brothers and sisters into mercenaries. They are turning the planet into a cemetery. They got folks out there working for war. 2, 3, 4. Make a whole lot of money, start a little trouble, it's a war. Turn this planet in the north and south, it's a war. Start a few rumors over there, make money with a war. Peace. Say it to yourself. I believe we got to work for peace. Peace ain't gonna be free, you gotta work for peace. You believe in peace, gotta go to work. They got folks out there working for war. Start a little trouble over here, what you got is war. Turn these folks in the north and south, it's war. Start a little trouble over here, what you got is war. Tell everybody you know, we gotta work for peace. Gotta work, gotta work. You believe in peace, time to go to work. I don't want to sound like no late night commercial, but it's a matter of fact that there are thousands of children all over the world, in Asia and Africa and South America, who need our help. When they start talking about 55 cents a day and 70 cents a day, I know a lot of folks feel as though that's not really any kind of contribution to make, but we had to give up $1.50 just to get in the subway nowadays. So this is a song about tomorrow and about how tomorrow can be better if we all, each one reach one, each one try to teach one. Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. Everyone must play a part. Everyone has got to go to work. Work for peace. Spirit say work. Work for peace. You believe in peace, say go to work. You believe in peace, time to go to work. Can't be waving your hand no more, go to work. Everything you ever really wanted, had to go to work.
Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely. Nothing. Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely. Nothing. Say it again, y'all. Look out. What is it good for? Absolutely. Nothing. Listen to me. I despise. Cause it means destruction of innocent lives. War means tears to thousands of mothers die when their sons go off to fight and lose their lives. I said war. Good God, y'all. What is it good for? Absolutely. Get said again. War. Lord. What is it good for? Absolutely. Listen to me. Wow. It ain't nothing but a heartbreak. Wow. Friend only to the undertaker. Oh, wow. Is an enemy to all things. The thought of war blows my mind. War has caused unrest within the younger generation. Induction, then destruction. Who wants to die? Oh, wow. Good God, y'all. What is it good for? Absolutely. Nothing. Said. Whoa. Oh, yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely. Nothing. Listen to me. Whoa. It ain't nothing but a heartbreaker. Whoa. It's got one friend, that's the undertaker. Oh, whoa. And shattered many young men's dreams. Made him disabled, bitter and mean. Life is much too short and precious to spend fighting wars each day. War can't give life, it can only take it away. Oh, war. Good God, y'all. What is it good for? Absolutely. Nothing. Say it again. War. Oh, Lord. What is it good for? Absolutely. Nothing. Listen to me. Wow. It ain't nothing but a heartbreaker. Wow. Friend only to the undertaker. Woo. Please love and understand and tell me, is there no place for them today? They say we must fight to keep our freedom, but Lord knows there's got to be a better way. Oh, wow. God, y'all. What is it good for? You tell me. Say it. Wow. Good God, now. What is it good for? Stand up and shout it. Nothing.
Just so you know, the video version cycles the live show 3 times with different music through the whole thing. What you're hearing now is music through the whole thing.
Okay, family, I'm going to sign off. Thank you all very much. You have a good night. And I was singing that Edwin Starr song in my head all night long. Or what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Good night. Peace.
We load the ship, we
Good night, Elise. Thank you.
we fly the plane.
Good night, everyone.
This is our day. We do the work. Boom, boom. We do the work. Boom, boom. We do the work. This is our day. We type the page. We clean the street. We sew the clothes. We change the sheets. We sell the goods. Yes, we do. We lay the stone. We do the work. This is our home. We do the work. 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 This is our home. We dig the ditch. Yes, we do. We serve the meal. We give the care. We mold the steel. We teach the kids. We lend a hand. We do the work. This is our land. We do the work. 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 This is our land. Oh, we do the work. 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 This is our land.
When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. Now they have taken untold millions they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel could turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. And in our hands is placed the power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of armies, magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, for the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.
He's 5'2" and he's 6'4". He fights with missiles and with spears. He's all 31 and he's only 17. He's been a soldier for 1,000 years. He's a Catholic, a Hindu, an atheist, a Jain, a Buddhist and a Baptist and a Jew. And he knows he shouldn't kill, and he knows he always will kill you for me, my friend, and me for you. And he's fighting for Canada, he's fighting for France, he's fighting for the USA. And he's fighting for the Russians, and he's fighting for Japan. And he thinks we'll put an end to war this way. And he's fighting for democracy and fighting for the Reds. He says it's for the peace of all. He's the one who must decide who's to live and who's to die. And he never sees the writing on the walls. But without him, how would Hitler have condemned him at Dachau? Without him, Caesar would have stood alone. He's the one who gives his body as a weapon to a war. And without him, all this killing can't go on. He's the universal soldier, and he really is to blame. But his orders come from far away no more. They come from him and you and me. And brothers, can't you see? This is not the way we put an end to war.